In this tutorial, I'm going to do something a little bit different. We're going to take a look at how to create a set of facial markers that can be used to animate on top of our blend shapes. So these markers can provide us with some more localized controls around areas of the face that tend to need some more fine-tuned adjustments than what you can get from just the blend shapes alone. And sometimes these adjustments are things that you don't necessarily plan for when you're creating your blend shapes. There might be only things that you really recognize once you start doing, start interpreting the performance capture data that you have, especially when you look back at the reference footage. So just going to give you kind of an idea of what this is going to look like, and then I will show you how to go about creating it. First off, we have the facial controls that we've seen in the previous videos. And these are in part going to help guide some of what we do with blend shapes and just some basic facial movements. But I'm going to turn those off real quick. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the finished facial markers that we're going to start working on in this video. And so what we have here is a left side and a right side version, blue and red. And as you can see here, these are around the brows, the eyes, the cheeks, sort of the nasolabial fold, the mouth. And so each of these markers is essentially placed at a spot where we often need more localized control. And I've sized the markers accordingly in case they get a little bit tighter, like around the eyes or the lips. And there are quite a few of them, as you can tell here. These are all placed right on the surface of the skin, and that's kind of the challenging part. In fact, it's not really challenging, it's just that you have to go about it in a way that utilizes some features within Maya that you might not already be familiar with. And then once we put these markers here, what we will do is essentially skin them by using the add influence command. But we'll hold off on worrying about that right now. For this video, I'm just going to work on creating the markers. I'm not going to create all of them, but I will create enough of them so that you can go through and you can follow my marker set here in this video and apply the rest yourself. So to get started, first off, I'm going to turn off the markers. And to get started, what I need to do is not work with the geometry that I have right here. This is my subdivision level 3 geometry, 70,000 polygons or so. And there's just too many vertices to work with. Effectively, what I want to do is to be able to select a vertex and apply a marker at that location. But it's just a little bit too complicated here to really see what I'm doing. So instead, I brought in my low resolution geometry, which we have here on a separate layer. And this is what I'm going to work with instead. I'm just going to assign the default material to that. And just change my background color here so it's easier to see. Now, now it's a lot easier to just grab a single vertex and know exactly what line I'm on. And I can also see here, if I really needed to refer back to it to guide myself, I could see exactly where those markers went. But I shouldn't really need to worry about that too much here. What I will do is I need to point out that when we go to create the marker placement, we are going to use a command we're going to use a feature called a cluster. And essentially, if we want to check out what clusters do, we can go to the rigging controls, rigging menu. And if I just go to vertex mode and select a vertex here, and I can go to deform cluster, find it right there. All right, and what that does is it creates this little C right here, and that stands for a cluster. And if I select the cluster and nothing else, just a cluster, it will move whatever is associated with it. So in this case, it's just a single vertex. I could select a bunch of vertices instead. So undo my cluster there so I don't keep that. Select a bunch of vertices and maybe something like that, right? It's kind of a weird selection, so let me just make it something more like this. Here's a little bit more localized. And I'll just repeat that, so deform cluster. And now I have a C there at the middle of that selection, which is important to understand that it goes to the middle of the selection. And now as I move this around, you'll see that it's moving all of those together. So it's a way to, it's a way to create a repeatable selection essentially at the component level within a model, as opposed to the object level. All right, so I don't need that cluster anymore. I can delete it. The clusters are things that we will see in our outliner as well, which I can point out too. So they are selectable there. You can delete them, you can group them, you can rename them, all of that. So what we're going to do is we're going to start in an area. We'll start with the brow first because it's the easiest one to work with. And we're going to create a series of clusters. And then we're going to use those clusters to attach the markers to. So the markers themselves are just going to be created using a polygon primitive soccer ball. All right, if we take a look at the soccer ball, just pull that up here. All right, it's just basically, it's like a sphere that's got hexagonal faces to it. Basically a soccer ball. And right now, if I was to try to attach this to the face, it's not really easy to do so. You know, I kind of got to put it in there and then try to figure out, is that in the right spot? And then if I move it, I have to kind of readjust its location in 3 dimensions. And that's just, it takes a little bit too long. Or for me, at least, I don't find it to be as accurate as I would like it to be. So what I do instead is to decide exactly where do I want the cluster to go, and then I will point snap that soccer ball to those clusters. So just to get that set up real quick, what I can do in here is to go in and go to vertex mode, and we're going to start our first cluster essentially where the eyebrow goes, from the inner part of the eyebrow, assuming that that's sort of here, almost at the bridge of the nose. So if I select here, and I'm only going to worry about one side because I can always mirror this over later. If I select here, I will go to Deform, Cluster. And it's just going to create a cluster on that vertex. Now, I am going to create a total of, and it's going to go back to the clusters that I have already created. I should say the markers that I've already created. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them, curling around here to about that midline coming out of the eyelid. And that's kind of probably a good place to think about where you want this to end. And these will be more or less evenly spaced. All right, so as I go through here, I want them to be fairly evenly spaced, but if I were to go from this vertex to this vertex, I would find that there is not enough space between here to evenly space out about 6 of these. So what I do is I generally will go through and start out on the first vertex. I just create a cluster. The next cluster point is going to be between this vertex and this vertex, which if I select both of them and I go to if I go to Deform Cluster, it gets placed between them. And that really kind of solves the issue that I was having. The next one will go on this vertex here. Just hit the G key to repeat the previous command, which was the cluster. And the next one will then go between these two. G to repeat. And then we'll put one right about here. In fact, I just want to check I am kind of cheating here. This one I placed a little bit farther down just because of trying to get it to even out. So what I'm going to do is place it here. Now this was done partly through trial and error before, which is why I don't entirely remember it just completely off the top of my head where I placed each and every individual cluster. I just know that I'm getting pretty close. So this one right here I think is more or less where I placed it, or actually just over here a little bit more. So there. So if we kind of compare where each of these is going here, and you're trying to do the same for your model, then you'll get something hopefully similar to this. It's a fairly reasonable, easy to create layout. All right. Now as we go around the eyes, for instance, the eyes have a lot more clusters around them. And if we just take a look at the markers real quick, you'll see that there are a total of, at the top, if we include the this one on the side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 on the top, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the bottom. All right. And the placement of these, again, is kind of like, in some cases, right on the vertex. In some cases, it's between two vertices. So the first one, if I turn off the markers, is going to sit right about, I think it's on that part right there. So I know that one of them is sitting right here. So follow this around, right about there. So, this might be slightly different for you. It doesn't have to match up perfectly, so long as it's close. And because this is just going to be for when we want to move just a little bit of the eye shape to conform to an eye movement or a brow movement even that you don't necessarily have the right eye shape for just from your blend shapes. So if I go up and I'll say deform cluster, we'll add one there. I'll come out here and place another one right here. And this next one is right here on this vertex. So we'll place it right there as well. And then the next one is between two vertices. So when we get these larger areas, sometimes we, when it's got a lot of complex geometry, we often need more clusters in a localized area. And then sometimes when we have broader geometry, we can get by with fewer. Between here and here, we should be able to get one in there. Just verifying that this is exactly where they go. So the next ones are between here and here. And then finally the last one I placed looks like down about here. All right, so that's the top eyelid. And then the bottom eyelid is a little bit of the same. So between here and here. One there. No, between here and here. There. Like I said, oftentimes I just do this through trial and error. I don't always have necessarily an exact plan of where they go. I just try to figure out what feels like the right number for this particular model. And I'm only going back to this sort of saved out version of my markers for this tutorial just to kind of keep things consistent with the way that I've created them already. So I wouldn't normally have such a easy thing to follow at my disposal. It's a cheat to make me feel more comfortable doing the tutorial. Okay, now I'm not going to go through and do the rest of the face because that will just be overkill. But what I will show you is how to place and size your markers and even sort of flip this over. So I've gone ahead and saved out a version of the clusters that I've already created for the entire face, which I will bring in here in just a moment. But before I do that, well, actually, no, I'll do that first and then we'll continue on. So I'm going to pause the video for a moment and then bring them back in. Okay, so I've gone through and created the remaining clusters for the left-hand side of the face. And right now, all we really need to worry about is one side of the face because we can always mirror it over afterwards. So now that we've done this, and you can just sort of have a real quick look at where they all sit in relationship to the individual vertices. Now that we've done this, we can start bringing in our marker. So I'm going to do that by creating a polygon soccer ball. And let's just go ahead and sort of move this over here. Now this soccer ball is going to be pretty large compared to my model. So my notes, I write down that this is about supposed to be about a size of 0.366 that I discovered I liked. And that actually might be, yeah, I think that might be the right size. And I also had gone ahead and added a color to this. So if I just pop into my hypershade real quick, I'm going to apply the color to this. Now this is just blue for the left side, red for the right side. And let's grab my blue color here, and I'll middle mouse click and drag that onto the little ball there. Make sure I put this back onto the screen. So this is just a basic Lambert material with a blue specular color, and you can use these settings if you want to copy mine exactly. It's not necessary. So there we go. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn off the visibility of my my head and just keep the visibility here on of the clusters. And I'm just going to call this L_MRK. That'll be the name for left marker. Now, as I go through here, I'm going to want to point snap this to each of these different clusters. So I'll duplicate this by hitting Control D to duplicate. And I will hold down V and point snap it to the cluster. But here's something I want you to pay attention to. Notice how I'm having a real hard time actually hitting the cluster itself. I'm hitting like vertices around it and other things, but I'm not quite on the cluster. This should be right in the middle. And I was kind of sort of banging my head a little bit here, trying to figure out what was the reason why this was not working properly. When I did this before, it was working fine, and I was using Maya 2016 at the time. I'm using Maya 2017 right now, and presumably this will still be true in later versions. I'm not sure. Maybe they'll fix this, but there happens to be an issue with point snapping to clusters when you are in Viewport 2.0. So if you go back to the legacy default viewport, this shouldn't be a problem. To sort of brighten things up here a little bit. So I'll hold down V now, and now I can point snap this to the center of that cluster, which is where I want it to be. All right, so Control D to duplicate and point snap there, and I'm just going to do this for all of those. I only found out the solution to that problem by doing a little bit of search online, which was, fortunately, somebody else had encountered it. Okay, so now that I've done that, just take a quick look at the geometry again. You can see that those sit there pretty well. But if I were to take this same size marker and place it around the eyes, those clusters are going to get really close together. I should say those markers are going to get really close together. So I'm going to go ahead and use a much smaller sized marker for the eyes. And let me just go ahead and I'll duplicate off another one. And I'm just going to sort of, make sure I hit duplicate, Control D. And if I put that there, turn on that off, put that there, and scale this down quite a bit. Let's just see what we get. So we want something that's pretty small, probably maybe like that will be good. So this is, let's just say 0.1, just to make it simple, 0.1 of our original size. It's nice and simple. All right, so I will go in and just create a bunch of these. All right, and point snap these all around. Control D, and then V. And if you're careful, this can go pretty fast. Now, I'm not worried about the naming of these markers so much. If you really want to be pedantic about it, you can. There we go. All right, cool. So if I turn on the geometry again, you can see that that's all sitting there quite nicely. So even if I turn on the high-res geometry, you see it's going to sit there nicely on the surface. All right. So what I would do is I would go through and I would continue to add these throughout the rest of the face. The markers that go along here, along the cheek and nasolabial fold and chin and whatnot, these will all be the same size as this original marker. The markers that go around the mouth will be about the size or maybe just slightly larger than the ones that go around the eyes, just because they get quite close together down here around the edges of the mouth. I think these ones are, if I look at my original version, they're just maybe 10 or 20% larger than the ones around the eyes. All right, so say that you've added all those in there and you want to now duplicate them over to the right-hand side of the face. What do you do? Okay, well, let me just get that original marker out of the way. What I would do is first I'll turn off the visibility of the head, and in fact what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off selection of geometry, just turning off this button, or turning on this button here. I will go ahead and I can select all of my clusters, and this is up to you. You could either delete them or you could add them to their own layer. I will add them to their own layer for now, and we'll just say clusters. Don't suppose I need them for any reason later on, but sometimes it's nice not to get rid of things. Just disabling them, that's all. And so what I would do is just imagine that you have all of your facial clusters here. All your facial markers here all the way down to the mouth. And draw a big selection. And then I would hit Control D. Sorry, not D. Excuse me. Back up. Control G to group. And this will be my markers left group. And then I would hit Control D to duplicate that group. And this will be my markers right group. So if I want to flip this over across the face, I'm going to go to Scale X, and I'm going to set the value to -1. All right. And that just throws these guys over here. Because I did that transform at the group level instead of on the individual geometry level, it shouldn't invert the normals, I think. I'm pretty sure it doesn't. It doesn't make any difference for us really, so long as they display fine in here, because we're never going to render these out. They're just for us to move around, so I'm not really too worried about that. But what I would do is I would grab all of the ones that are associated with the right-hand side, and I have created a red material for that side. Same thing as my blue material, except for it's red, and I changed the specular color to red as well. And I would just go ahead and select those guys again, and assign that material there. And now I have a red side and I have a blue side. And that's how I would go about creating these markers for the face. And then you could turn back on our viewport 2.0. And so if I were to come back over here and just, this is my original version, you can see this is what they would all look like in the end. So I'm going to stop the video here because this is just about the creation of the marker set. We'll take a look at how to actually go ahead and skin these to the geometry so that it doesn't conflict with the blend shapes in another video.